books. All of the key concepts of these 2 books. Closing thought, though, on that before we move forward. Somebody want to read that out loud for me? This is a job description. Posted in a newspaper.
Men wanted for constant strength, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success.
Everybody signed up? Yep. Woohoo! I'm in. The Endurance, fairly famous example of Antarctic exploration. Sir Ernest Shackleton took a bunch of guys, this was in 1914, to explore Antarctica, where the penguins are. Really far South Pole, brr, cold, right? Just like in here. Just kidding, no. Lots of those expeditions fail for a wide variety of reasons. His was famous because in October of 1914, they got stuck in the ice. Think old-fashioned ship. And they basically just camped out. Didn't lose any of the guys. And it took 14 months of trekking, boat crushed in ice, camping together, walking together, until they finally found land 370 miles from where the ship was originally encased in ice. He didn't lose a single guy.
Wow.
Nobody defected, nobody died. Why? Well, the difference was, this was his attitude. A lot of expeditions at the time talked about the amount of money you could get out of it, or how much they were willing to pay. What does that ad say to you about the people who respond to Shackleton's ad? What do they like?
Danger.
Danger is my middle name. They are all about the danger. And so when he found people that believed what he believed, his why was about adventure and hardship and putting your life at risk and all that other stuff. He found people that matched his why. His organization was successful. Didn't lose anybody, they all had a good time, lost a few fingers along the way, became famous. So part of the message in Senec's work is when you're building the organization, if you're in a hiring position, or if you are a manager of humans in your organization in any way, part of your challenge is to find people that believe what you believe. Ask yourself in your organization, have you clearly defined the why? I know Jim Katz has. And is everybody in the organization somebody who believes what you believe? If you hire people that don't believe what you believe, that don't match your why, what happens? Are they happy? Did they stay? Did they pass on the culture of the organization? Probably not. Is that easy to do? Is it better to find somebody that believes what you believe and doesn't have the skill set? Or to hire the person that's got all the tricks but doesn't believe what you believe? You hire for culture, hire for belief, hire for the why. Then you create that long-term loyalty that we're all trying to get to. You can teach the other stuff. But that's not what we always say we want. And we're going to talk a little bit in a little while about our bias and how sometimes what we think we want is not actually what we want. But we're going to start this session with Angela Duckworth's grit. Anybody get a chance to watch Angela's video or take the grit scale? Yes. All right. Were you gritty? Yes, we work in the gymnastics business. By definition, we're all gritty. Her definition of grit is the power of passion and perseverance. She became famous in about 2009, I think, was her first TED Talk, when she decided this is something that interested her. She was a McKinsey consultant, then went and taught public schools, did a PhD in psychology, decided her mission in life, her why, was figuring out this thing. What makes people successful in terms of grit? So we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. Do you think kids are gritty today? Do we find that same grit that we had back in the day when we were all walking 10 miles each way through the snow uphill to school?
No, it's lack of effort. I mean, if when you get back in the game and you take a 2-point lead and you can't figure out a way to sprint down the floor and guard somebody, I don't know what to tell you. Unfortunately, I really don't. And if we don't figure this out in a hurry, it's going to be games like this where we can't close out because we're not tough enough to sprint the floor and come up with a stop. Now, the sad thing about it is we came up like 6 stops, 7 stops in a row starting the fourth quarter. But then when it becomes crunch time, you take a 2-point lead, God forbid, that's when you have to get one. And we just refuse. And it's our upperclassmen, unfortunately.
Are you inspired? The Louisville men's basketball coach. Yeah. This is Mike Leach, the football coach at Washington State University.
Softball game, you know, I mean, that's what we are, a JC softball team. As long as, you know, it's not whether you win or lose. It's like the team that wins is the one that has the most fun. You know, that crap like that. You know, all this stuff that's contaminated America, where they give every kid a trophy and they don't keep score in Little League anymore. You know, so I think that entire thing is retarded the competitive spirit of America, and I think we need to keep that in mind. And as coaches, you know, we need to aggressively reinforce our points.
So, needless to say, if you've interpreted anything I've said so far, you can probably guess that I disagree with those two coaches on a wide variety of things. But is that fairly typical of what we see, at least in the professional sports world, criticism? And have you or any of your colleagues said, kids just aren't tough anymore, they're too soft, they're snowflakes, it's the trophy participation generation, blah, 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 blah. Well, Professor Duckworth's done some research to try to figure out what is this grit thing, and are we truly worse at it? Have we made a soft generation that just doesn't get it? Because there's some generational research that says, yes, that when you grow up in a society where there's no war for you, there's no economic challenge, there's no depression, your life isn't that bad, that you get a little softer versus the greatest generation. Anybody have parents or grandparents or great-grandparents who lived through the Depression and will tell you about washing out paper bags and all the thrifty things they did, and they were the tough ones? Well, yeah, they were grittier, I think. But there's an argument to be made that that's not really the whole story. Duckworth's work is interesting because she started looking at a couple of places. One of the first places she looked to try to figure this out was West Point. Anybody have a relative, friend, anybody that went to West Point? The United States Military Academy in upstate New York is where we develop future Army officers. And do you know what happens the summer before you go to West Point? When you're signed up to be a cadet? Anybody know? You show up. And you do this thing called the Beast, is the nickname for WCS, which is essentially hazing, for lack of a better word, 12 weeks of deciding, are you tough enough? And what she wanted to study was if she could predict who's going to be successful in surviving this beast phase, this 12-week summer experience. So what she did was she came up with a grit scale, the same thing that you guys took. She measured people as they came in, and she measured it against the candidate score too. Because everybody that goes to West Point gets scored as a candidate based on their grades, they were a great athlete, their recommendations, all this other stuff, right? Goes into the package and they get a number. But what they found was that score had zero relationship to predicting the people that survived that summer. In other words, you might have a great score and look like the ideal candidate, but you washed out of the beast. You might have a really low score, but you crushed the beast and made it through fine. There was one score thing they did, though, that almost perfectly predicted who would survive the beast. Guess what it was? The grit scale. That same little 10-question thing you took predicted perfectly, nearly perfectly, whether or not people survived that experience. She's done the same thing with teachers in inner city schools and all sorts of tough environments to try to figure out what is it that makes people go through hard times. How do we get there? She goes into a little bit of history and decides that as Americans in particular, we have this interesting tension between talent and effort. If I asked you, would you rather be talented or hardworking, how many of you would pick talented? One honest person. All right. How many of you would prefer to be hardworking? Okay. If I said whatever group you're working with, office staff, team, dance, cheerleaders, you would rather have a really talented group or a really hardworking group? Hardworking. That's what you all say. That's what everybody says, but guess what we actually value in our society?
Talent.
Talent. Dating, same thing. How many of you have married or are dating the person who has the best character and conversational stuff, even though they're not particularly attractive? We say we want that, I'm the guy with the nice personality who suffers from this all the time. But what we say and what we do isn't necessarily consistent. Americans, when you survey, and also short, Americans endorse being hardworking 5 times as important in hiring as intelligence. We consistently say we value hard work, but as a society, what do we hold up? Talent. Here's the problem. How do you get talent? You're born. So if you didn't win the genetic lottery, do you have any hope whatsoever? Well, it turns out that, yeah. In fact, the people that are the most successful in life in most measures and ways are not the most talented. They have this thing called grit. And in fact, would you believe me if I told you that quite often the people with the most talent are not the most successful because they lack grit, and therefore when things get hard, what happens? And we've all had that kid.
We quit.
They quit. So how do we deal with talent versus effort? What does that say about what we believe and what we want to do? A couple interesting examples. Anybody remember Enron? So this was an energy company in Texas that was started by a bunch of former consultants from the company that was the rival of the company I used to work for. Smartest guys and gals on the planet. They brought together a group of really smart people who convinced everybody that they knew what to do with energy stuff. And they basically created this fantasy world that became worth billions of dollars, and it went way up and up in the stock market until an accounting firm said, well, wait, that's not real. And the floor fell out from under the thing. They got crushed because everybody was willing to give them money because they appeared as very smart, talented humans. And nobody asked if they were working really hard at it or if there was any substance. Jeff Skilling used to work for a company called General Electric. And he had this interesting concept called rank and yank. This was their deal. Employees every year were graded on a scale of 1 to 5. 10% of employees had to be ranked a 5 and fired each year. How do you feel about that? His theory was that, well, we need to get the talent to rise to the top. We want the most talented people. We won't measure anything else. We'll just grade everybody and then rank and kick people out. Do you feel inspired yet? Not so much. Then there's Apple. Love this thing, right? I'm saying all these great things about Apple. I also think Steve Jobs was kind of a psychopath in some ways and had some really terrible, very bad ideas. One is his concept of A players versus B players versus C players. An A player is somebody who's really talented.
Which I didn't know how to explain it then, but I've thought a lot about it since. Most things in life, the dynamic range between average and the best is at most 2 to 1. Right? Like if you go to New York City and you're getting an average taxi cab driver versus the best taxi cab driver, you're probably going to get to your destination with the best taxi cab maybe 30% faster. In an automobile, what's the difference between an average and the best? Maybe, 20%. The best CD player and an average CD player, 20%. So 2 to 1 is a big dynamic range in most of life. In software, and it used to be the case in hardware too, the difference between average and the best is 50 to 1, maybe 100 to 1. Easy. Okay? Very few things in life are like this. But what I was lucky enough to spend my life in is like this. And so I've built a lot of my success off finding these truly gifted people.
So his basic theory was that you find the best people and they would hire the best people and we just have all the most talented people around. It worked a little bit on the surface, but if you dig in underneath, Apple had a lot of turnover and a lot of unhappy people. In spite of their great why, their great culture, this part of their deal wasn't great. Duckworth argues that we have an implicit bias against strivers. That as a country, we are biased against people that have to work really hard versus who are really talented. Keep the politics out of it, just talk about ability to connect with people and speak. Bill Clinton, by most accounts, was a naturally talented orator, speaker. He was really good at just getting people to buy his thing. It was natural. He had that good old boy shtick where he could shake anybody's hand and they would give him money and sign up. His wife, on the other hand, because couples often have counterbalancing things, right? A lot of us find our opposite. She was highly criticized for not being very good at connecting. She didn't have the natural shtick. She wasn't a naturally gifted speaker. And so people have criticized her as a politician because she doesn't give a great speech. But she works really hard. And by any reasonable measure, if you evaluate their lives, most people would say she works twice as hard as he does. Do we have a bias against people that work hard? Duckworth's theory of achievement is basically this, a little math. And Will Smith has this great quote that I think exemplifies it. Where I excel is ridiculous, sickening work ethic. The only thing that I see that is distinctly different about me is I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill. If we get on the treadmill together, either you're getting off first or I'm going to die. It's really that simple. Now, Will also happens to be a really tall, handsome, good-looking, athletic, charismatic dude, so I ain't feeling that sorry for him and his lack of talent. But she came up with this interesting way to think about talent versus skill and effort. Talent is how quickly your skills improve when you invest effort. Think about that for a second. Talent is how quickly your skills improve when you invest effort. So you have a certain amount of talent. When you put effort in, that multiplies the talent and gets you skill. But when you get that skill and then you apply real effort, that gets you to achievement. I'm not really good at math, but the way this works out is if you have somebody who's twice as talented but works half as hard, they don't get nearly as far. Talent is a great differentiator. It matters quick, but skill matters more. And skill only happens with effort. There's been a bunch of different ways this has been tested over time. The 1940 Harvard treadmill test. So think about this. Get put in an uphill treadmill and run 5 minutes as fast as you can until you're ready to collapse. 1940, Harvard scientists researched this and then they tracked people over time based on how long they were willing to suffer in that 5 minutes, how hard they went. Guess what they found in terms of how successful people were later in life just based on that 5-minute treadmill test? Who was more successful?
The ones that were
People that didn't mind suffering.
Yeah.
In fact, people that embraced suffering, were willing to punish themselves for the sake of advance. We don't have time to do this, but an interesting exercise that Warren Buffett does in terms of finding out what are you willing to drive for is write down 15 career goals, circle the 3 highest, and then avoid the others at all costs. Narrow your focus to things that you're willing to suffer for as you move forward. We know that people that do this, that are really persistent, are more successful over time. The Stanford Study of Evidence said this. They looked at 301 people and tried to figure out what makes people really successful, and it broke down to 4 things. Number 1, you work with distant objects in view towards a definite goal. Make sense? People that have a definite goal are more successful. You have a tendency not to abandon tasks and not just looking for change. Do you know anybody that just needs things to change often because they get bored really easily and want to move on to the next thing job-wise? If you don't do that, if you have these 2 things, you have passion. Number 3, the degree of strength, will, and determination to stick with a task. When it gets hard, do you keep going or do you give up? Number 4, tendency not to abandon tasks in the face of obstacles. Sort of the same thing. This boils down, according to Duckworth, into 2 things, passion and perseverance. That is the essence of grit. Something that you believe in and you're willing to suffer for it over an extended period of time. Where does it come from? They've tried to figure out, doing twin studies, can you develop this or do you inherit it? Passion, you inherit about 20% of that. But perseverance, your ability to grind, you get about 30% of that in your genes. Which means if your parents are both grinders, it is highly likely you're going to be a grinder as well. If your parents are not grinders, not persistent people, it is highly unlikely that you will grind naturally.
Did they go to the nurture and nature of that?
So the nurture part of it is this teachable. You stole my thunder, but the answer is yes! Yes! Part of it is clearly inherited. And there's societal stuff too. The Flynn effect says, does it improve globally over time? Do you think we're getting grittier in the last 100 years or less gritty? Most people would say less gritty. Why is that? The Flynn effect says, in general, we get better at everything. You guys, on average, the average IQ in the room is probably, let's just pick a random number, I don't know, 115. If we took your IQ, the average person in the room, and put you into 1890 in this same place, you would be the smartest person in the place in the state of Nevada. Because the average IQ at that time was about 70. Sheer genius. Everyone want to sign up for Time Machine? Woo! I'm going back and being smart. What the Flynn effect says is over time we get better at everything in society. We are smarter, we are faster, we are stronger, we are taller. Does it make any sense that we would get less gritty then? Duckworth says, well, maybe it's not that we're getting less gritty. Maybe we get gritty later. Because maturation is getting delayed. Think about the impact of this on your kids. 50 years ago, how old was the average person out on their own, having a family, making babies, responsible for themselves? 18, 20, 22? When does the average person marry and have babies today? 25. Go back 200 years. 200 years ago, how old were you when you went off on your own? 12, 14. So, if society has improved, then maybe one of the answers to the grit challenge is we are maturing later in life. So the 12-year-old who 50 years ago would have been really gritty, just at a different place in the maturation cycle. So maybe we need to be aware of that and be a little more patient with them, that it's not just generational. But our bottom line is that this concept called neuroplasticity is really important. The simple version is you can tell yourself a different story and change the way your brain works. Can you learn it? Absolutely. Can you teach young people to become tougher, to develop passion and persistence, to become grittier over time? The answer is yes. The brain science is really conclusive. Think of the softest kid you know, or human. Like, just give up instantly and whine and moan and just can't take any discomfort whatsoever. That person, the softest human you know, we know that this can be changed. You can teach grit, but it's not easy. Why do people quit stuff? Here's some of the most common reasons. The four most common are boredom. The effort is not justified by the outcome. Why should I try? I'm not going to win anyway. It's not that big a deal. I'll just try golf next week. It's just gymnastics. It's not important enough. Or I'm unable to do it well. Have you had a kid like this? If I can't be great at it, I just don't want to do it. Can you change this though? If that's their thinking process, that's what makes them quit. Can you change it? Absolutely. And it comes down to four things. And the way I remember this is acronym IPPH. Interest, practice, purpose, and hope. This is Duckworth's secret recipe for how do I teach grit. Interest, practice, purpose, and hope. Interest. This is a problem for us. In the US, more than 2/3 of adults are not engaged at work. If you're not interested in what you do, you will not persist when it gets hard. Worldwide, only 13% of adults call themselves engaged. And that's about my experience too. Less than 1 out of 5 people I meet, would I say, are really passionate and engaged in what they're doing. If you're not interested, are you going to persist when things get hard? No. One of the things to know about this is that interest is rarely about that mythical romantic phase. Sorry, bad dating analogy again. When you first start dating somebody, what are the first 3 months like? Woo! It's all wine and roses and pheromones and chemistry and hormones, life is good. Then after 3 months, oh, he doesn't put the cap on the toothpaste. That really bothers me, right? That's when the work becomes, we have to recognize that sustained interest is longer than that mythical romantic phase. It requires some introspection, reflection, and occasional play, goofing around and experimenting. How many of you, even if you have very high-level kids, play gymnastics? I know you guys do. Most gyms do not ever play gymnastics. We have worked on the assumption that kids, by the time they're 14 or so, should be very serious about this. There's no play involved. This is gymnastics. But we know that developing interest requires play. How many of you have seen a kid who had the fun sucked out of their gymnastics world and then they're done?
Yeah.
Well, it's not like Mike Leach said, well, it's not about having fun anymore. It has to be about having fun, because guess what? When you're not having fun, that's called a job. I mean, That's not what we do. What we do is a calling. But not fun is a job. Find new sources of novelty. That's one way to keep interest going. Do you, in the course of your thing, whatever you do in the gym, do you find new ways to do stuff, new things to learn, new ways to orient so that the job changes a little bit because you need some novelty? Practice. I'll read the Dilbert cartoon because I can't see all of it. Studies show that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to be great at anything. I think that willingness to practice the same thing for 10,000 hours is a mental disorder. Makes me feel better about my mediocrity. It's okay. It's fine. So, practice. How many of you have heard of this 10,000 hours theory? A guy named Anders Ericsson, a researcher in Florida, did a study on violinists in Germany. And he wanted to find out how many hours does it take to become an expert in something. And this got really shifted around a little bit. Malcolm Gladwell used it in a book called The Tipping Point. The guy that studied the violinists found that 10,000 hours, about that time, was what it took to become an expert at something. But is it any 10,000 hours? Is it just time? The answer is no. I have played the guitar poorly for 40 years. I mean, badly. I've stayed at the same place for 40 years. I practice. I am confident I have put 10,000 hours into guitar at this point. Am I an expert? Have I mastered it? Hell no. Why? Because half the time when I sit down, I'm watching TV and I'm trying a new thing, and then my fingers hurt, and then I don't really like the way it sounds, and I just stop. Practice is not just about time on task, it's about deliberate practice, which is extremely effortful. I'm going to use that word later too, effortful. Practice is hard. How many hours a day do you think those elite violinists practice at the level that gets them to that 10,000 hour mark? Turns out that 3 to 4 hours is about the most time that anybody can do anything that is supremely effortful. 3 to 4 hours a day. Which is why great gyms rarely go to the 6-hour one, let's just practice gymnastics. It doesn't work that well. Practice is one of the ways to develop grit. With intentional practice at something, you get better at it, and it's more likely that you will persist. It's more likely you won't get bored with it. It's more likely you'll start to feel better about what you're doing. But do you think the people that put that 10,000 hours in are the most talented? This is not the place about talent. This is about deliberate effort and intention. I don't have a ton of time. I have a little, do you guys know David Blaine? So I'm going to give you a couple minutes of this TED Talk.
As a magician, I try to create images that make people stop and think. I also try to challenge myself to do things that doctors say are not possible. I was buried alive in New York City in a coffin, buried alive in a coffin in April 1999 for a week. I lived there with nothing but water. And it ended up being so much fun that I decided I could pursue doing more of these things. The next one is I froze myself in a block of ice for 3 days and 3 nights in New York City. That one was way more difficult than I had expected. The one after that, I stood on top of a 100-foot pillar for 36 hours. I began to hallucinate so hard that the buildings that were behind me started to look like big animal heads. So next I went to London. In London I lived in a glass box for 44 days with nothing but water. It was for me one of the most difficult things I'd ever done, but it was also the most beautiful. There were so many skeptics, especially the press in London, that they started flying cheeseburgers on helicopters around my box to tempt me. So I felt very validated when the New England Journal of Medicine actually used the research for science. My next pursuit was I wanted to see how long I could go without breathing, like how long I could.
Okay. On the count of 3, everybody hold your breath. Ready? 1, 2, 3. 16 seconds, the first one to go. So David Blaine goes on in this talk, and what's powerful about it is he's a magician, but he's not really. What he's really good at is just persistent, effortful, deliberate practice to get good enough at something to make it possible. So he goes through this breath holding thing, and it's a really powerful TED Talk. He's funny, but he's crying at the end because of the journey that he went through. At the end, he held his breath underwater for 16 minutes.
Good God.
16 seconds. 16 minutes. He does not have the lungs of an elephant. He doesn't have any special abilities or special powers, but he wanted to find out what he could do. And that's his deal in life, is challenging himself. So he practiced. He practiced and he practiced.